Okay, we are going live on kind of a special or a little different historical detective agency kind of a talk. Good Shabbos to everyone. It's Friday, February 13th, 2026, and we're going to go over a topic that's been hitting pretty hot on X and a lot of the social media and a lot of the sites. And again, it comes down to a lack of historical knowledge about the topic that is generating a lot of the anger, a lot of the misunderstandings and things like that. Although I do suspect that people at the higher echelons do understand what they're doing, which is keeping people at odds against each other in order to facilitate an outcome that they desire. It's throughout time, right? Machiavelli didn't invent it, nor did Trump, did anybody else, right? It's been a human condition throughout time. If I can have groups of people that are at odds with one another, or I can set someone up as kind of a boogeyman. I have a method of control and mechanism by doing it, and history bears this out. I would definitely recommend going over some of the old historical detective agency videos in order to kind of see that pattern in some more granular detail in historical cases, especially with the American oligarchs. For those of you new here or the new subscribers, we've actually kind of blown up a little bit, at least from my perspective, on Substack. This was supposed to be a small group that kind of ties in all of our little investigator groups that we use all over the United States and a couple over in South America and Asia. However, it kind of jumped the shark or jumped the bottle, as you will. And we've got a lot of people in here that are just interested in the topics, both the craft of historical investigations, current private investigation, and some of the topics like what we're going to talk about today. I would invite everyone who's not already, go over on our Substack at History DA. That's History Detective Agency, just the word DA, and you'll see a lot of the articles that we've done. We did a bunch on silver, the history of silver, 3 cases studies that might interest people. For example, The Wizard of Oz was actually about silver, silver slippers, and it was a commentary, a sly commentary on the basing of U.S. coinage on silver, which would benefit the farmers and that sort of thing. So you get to a little bit about that, and L. Frank Baum and his political views and how they influenced into the original book about what the topic was actually about. The next thing was the gunfight at the OK Corral actually had to do with silver and making sure that the shipments that were going along with Western Union's the silver that was going along Western Union to the East Coast was getting to Britain, right? So to maintain those supply lines, Wyatt Earp and his brothers had to pretty much be activated and go after the cowboy gang, right, in order to make sure that those silver runs were not interrupted. And then the third and final was about the Sengoku Jidai period, which is the Warring States period in Japan, and how silver really influenced that and the isolation that they occurred afterward. And that was absolutely fascinating about how a technical change can do that. So we have a lot of other topics. Today is going to be a little bit of a heavy topic, just before Shabbos here. And the reason is it's come up and the detection is there. My previous life, if you will, was the U.S. Army. We would look at radicalization processes. We would look at narratives that were creating or exacerbating the incidents of terrorism. Started out in EOD, did counter ID, then would investigate the physical side of it, post blast and that sort of thing. But then began to look at the networks. Okay, what's their capability and all that sort of thing. But the most fascinating part is what makes a guy want to build a bomb, right? Because it's not like you're just anger in the moment and using a gun or a knife, right? It's not a passionate, sudden reaction either through fear or anger. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes a lot of planning to be able to make a bomb and to create an insurgency, right? It takes a lot of work. So what kind of makes someone get into that is fascinating. And there's the ones that are just technically curious, like Thomas Edison, that makes bombs. But then there are those that will maintain long campaigns of IEDs and terrorism against others. And information was absolutely part of it. History was the bedrock of the belief system and why they believed who they were, what was their role in society, and how they should view others. And that was history. That was their view of history, and that was critical in being able to radicalize groups, is to create and control the narrative of history. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about one of those things that, in my opinion, is along those lines. It's creating existing lines, it's exacerbating existing lines of tension that have been laid in for a long time, but have evolved over time. And now the narrative is shifting somewhat, but it seems to be pretty much for the same end. So with that, a disclaimer, I am Jewish. And so this will be coming from a person who grew up first half of the life, possibly, I wouldn't say atheist, but agnostic. In other words, I wasn't drilled into any distinct discipline within Judaism. It was more reform. I would go wherever, whatever was there, listen to different things, and that sort of thing. So dad was in his third or fourth entry into the army. He was involved with social work services and things like that. So he would work with chaplaincy corps. So we'd have, sometimes there'd be a rabbi at the house, sometimes there'd be a chaplain, sometimes there'd be, I don't know, whoever, was at the house, and they would discuss things on a religious basis along with social work. So I was exposed at a young age to other traditions besides Judaism on an intellectual basis, right? So what I believed was different, and as over time it changed. I gravitated initially to reform Reconstructionists, when I was younger, but right around 1999, 2000, it shifted and it became more Orthodox, and later on it shifted to more Hasidus, and that sort of thing. So eventually, what you'll hear is someone who has seen different phases of Judaism. So the first thing that I would have to say, and the topic is Zionism, and the topic specifically is about what occurred in Trump's religious freedom council a few days ago, when Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick actually booted off a member. It was Carrie Prejean Bollier, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but that was it. And he basically booted her off of this religious freedom council because there's different reasons, but apparently it was because she was asking a question. In other words, if my religious belief does not recognize Zionism, is that wrong, right? In other words, am I going to be allowed to say that? Because there are many rules and regulations within some government agencies, within other agencies and things like that, where they do kind of make it very difficult for people to express political opinions on it, because then it's seen as hate speech, right? They'll say it's hate speech, you can't say this, and that sort of thing. And they'll also say it's anti-Semitic, which in itself is a misnomer, because Semites are it's an ethnic group which includes a lot of Arabs. It includes Palestinians. It includes many groups within the Mizrahi community in the Middle East, but many others, including Arabs, Muslims, Christians, atheists, right? So everything is within this group. So saying it's anti-Semitic is a misnomer. It's anti-Jewish, right? So in other words, we have to make sure we keep our terms correct in what we're saying and what we're doing. Anti-Semitism has a charge to it. It has a totemic effect that actually discourages sometimes understanding and kind of a rational evaluation of what's going on. And again, that may be by design, I don't know, but it has that effect. So what we're going to be talking about is essentially that, but we're going to be looking at it through the lens of what's the actual historical record about a predominant Jewish belief system, about Zionism, about that milieu, and looking at dispensationalism, the Christian version of it, the predominant Jewish version of it, things like that. So the first thing we'll say is we need to level off terms and terminology, because this is one of those subjects that has a tremendous amount of misunderstanding about it. A lot of people have no clue about most of what they're saying. It's just reflexive, right? It's what they've learned. It's sound bites, and they just say it out there. It's not grounded in any type of historical record or the reflection of the truth. And both sides, I would say both sides have a lot wrong. Both sides, right? So we're going to get that out of the way right away, right? In other words, there's a tremendous amount of, the pro-Zionist that's completely wrong. There's a tremendous amount of the anti-Zionist that are wrong in how they kind of approach it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about that to kind of move out a lot of that misconception, the historical inaccuracies, so that people can kind of look at the issues and deal with the issues, which may be why there's so much confusion there, is because people don't want to look at the issues and deal with the issues. So the first thing we've already talked about, being anti-Semitic means that you don't like Semites, which would mean you also don't like Jordanians, you don't like a lot of Arab populations, you don't like Lebanese, you don't like Palestinians, right? That's anti-Semitic. And in that, Mizrahi Jews, right? Because that's an ethnicity, right? Semitic is not a religion. And I would defer to Rabbi Shapiro, not Ben Shapiro, the talk show guy, but there's a Rabbi Shapiro, Yaakov Shapiro, I believe, who's actually very good at stating, okay, this is the traditional view of Judaism. What is Judaism, right? Because we have gone over time, it has shifted, right? The definition in the popular discourse, not necessarily the religious discourse, you're at the yeshiva level, you're not going to study it this way, but outside of the yeshiva, you're going to look at what is Judaism has changed over time. And it has devolved, I would say, into this belief in the magic elf people, right? Either, so evil or so good and not human. And that unfortunately is the way. So philo-Semites or philo-Jews, people that are not Jewish but support Jews, are actually a problem for the Jewish community, and people that hate Jews are also a problem for the community. And actually, that was quoted by, I believe it was Alfred Weimar, who was a German, Jewish German, who was a veteran of World War I and a very good investigator. And after World War I, he wrote two pamphlets. He did a huge investigation about why Germany suddenly shifted after World War I into an external force that was promoting. He called it anti-Semitism. It's actually anti-Judaism, but he called it anti-Semitism within the Weimar Republic, and created eventually that. He wrote one in 1919, right after the war, when he was discharged, and then again in 1922. And he went to houses. He had houses. He had names. Where brochures were printed outside of Germany and flown in, and the occupation zones in the South, and the Saar. It really got into the granular detail. Suffice to say, he said, I don't want anti-Semites, but I also don't want philo-Semites. Both are equally bad for the Jewish people. And he was correct, right? And so in that respect, you have to be very cautious in the magic elf person theory, right? Jews are human beings, right? That's it, period, right? The same as a Buddhist, the same as, now I'll get in trouble with a rabbi because he's like, you have a neshama, there's the Benoni, you have the neshama, you have a different neshama. But in reality, this is it, right? What I can prove, what is provable, a human being, right? Everything is human beings. And it is a religion. It's the belief that the laws of the covenant, there's a covenant between God and people who accept the covenant based on that Har Sinai, right, at Mount Sinai. And that's it, right? And you believe in the laws of Moses, and you'll try as much as you can within the realm that you can to obey to 613 mitzvahs. Not all apply to you, but you at least recognize them, and that's your goal. 613 mitzvahs, we're going to do that, right? And that's it. And those came to Moses, Rabbeinu Moshe, Moses on Mount Sinai, Har Sinai, and that's it. And it's passed l'dor v'dor from generation to generation. There you go. That's it, right? But it's not, and over time, different levels had to be in there. So that's one thing. It's religion. It's not a race. It's not even an ethnicity. It's not even a culture, right? So I would recommend, some book. There's a book by Herman Wouk, and a couple others that are very good about looking out at the global Jewish areas in all the world. Different Jewish groups have gone up from India to Britain to South America to all different groups, and the cultures are different. If you go to Mizrahi and say, okay, hey, let's go out for bagels and lox, they're like, why are we going for the Scandinavian food, right? But if you say it somewhere in America, they're like, oh, that's a good Jewish food, we're going to go nosh, right? It's different cultures. There's no Jewish culture. There's no Jewish humor. There's no Jewish culture globally, right? It's mixed up. It's everything. It's like saying that, a small area in one state of the United States is white culture, and that's it. No, there's all kind of different things, right? What are we talking? We can't even define it. So the problem is, number one, the myth of the Jew, the myth of the magic elf person, that has to go away. It's just human beings that are religious in a belief system. The problem came in when the Jews adopted, the majority in these Ashkenazic areas began to adopt, your mother's Jewish, therefore you're Jewish. And they called it ethnicity over time. It was philos back in the day, but over time it became thought of as ethnicity or race. And to be fair, even people thought Britain was a race, America was a race. The term race has actually changed over time. So depending when you're going to look at these writings, they'll use interchangeably race. What they mean is ethnicity or perhaps culture and that sort of thing. So keep that in mind, but it's not a race. Judaism, in the terms that we understand now, it's not a race. It's not even an ethnicity. And I'll show you an excellent one that I think everybody should read. He doesn't come at it from religion. The problem with arguing religion, it's like arguing literature about Harry Potter fandom or Star Trek. Not to degrade the religion, but arguing on those things. You're looking at a text. You're looking at an experience that people have had individually, reading those texts, and then they're arguing about what the text actually means. So it's very similar to a fan of a science fiction film saying, okay, let's argue the details here about what it really means. You're never really going to have an answer, and you're never really going to solve anything. So what we're doing here, especially on a subject matter as important as this, where lives are at stake, we're just going to go, these are the facts. And you can believe what you believe, and at the end of it, there is a God, and he's going to decide what it is. But for now, we're going to have to deal with what we can deal with in facts. So this I would definitely recommend, and it's by Shlomo Sands. He's actually professor at Tel Aviv University. He was born in his parents were Holocaust survivors. He was born in a concentration resettlement camp after the concentration camps were liberated. He was born in that and then moved to Israel. But he was trained in what they call Wissenschaft, which is a truth craft of history. And in Israel, there's two history departments in every university. At Tel Aviv University, you're going going to have the Israeli Historical Studies Department, which is a separate school, and then you're going to have the Western studies, everybody else's history, and that's a different school. He was in the everybody else in the world, so he was trained in what's called Wissenschaft, which is a very scientific, evidence-based approach, kind of what we try to do here. Take the emotion out. Let's just go evidence-based and what we can prove. So he was trained in that discipline. And as he said, he had the epistemological moment one day to say, I'm looking up the Roman period. So I'm studying here. He looked up the Roman period and he said, okay, I can't find in all the Roman literature in Greece or Turkey, any of the Roman thing, I can't find where that expulsion order comes for Israel. When did we Jews get kicked out of Israel? He's trying to find this, and he can't find it in his archives. He can't find it in Roman archives. He can't find it anywhere. He said, well, maybe it must be over in the section of the Israeli studies here at Tel Aviv University. So he walks across campus, according to him, goes to the Israeli studies section, and he says, hey guys, I need those source documents for when the Romans, kicked us out, or the evidence that we're saying that the Romans kicked us out of Judea, not Israel, it was Judea, back in 73, the 8th century, 80 AD, 73 AD, after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And they went, we don't have it. Anyway, huh? and the more he dug, he realized that never occurred. The leaders of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was the third and kind of final major revolt that occurred in Judea, the leadership and the rulers were brought into Rome, and they were the ones on the Arch of Titus that were represented. The temple was destroyed. It was reduced by the Romans, and Josephus wrote about that. But there was no mass expulsion, not like in Romania, which used to be Dacia. Why we don't know anything about Dacians, even their language, is because Rome actually said they're gonna make it like Carthage. They're gonna salt the earth. There's not gonna be anything left. That never occurred in Judea, right? Like I said, the upper crust that were part of the revolution or responsible for controlling that revolution, the Bar Kokhba revolt, they were brought to Rome and imprisoned or executed. The temple was reduced. Jerusalem was off limits for every circumcised male for about 8 to 9 months, and then that was it. So there's that myth one that needs to go away, and he backs it up with some very good and convincing documentation from Tel Aviv University. That didn't happen. So that's myth number one, that there was this forced exile. Didn't occur. So there we go. The second thing that he noticed is he began to do research. So that was interesting to him. Like, I'd grown up, and he grew up in the Israeli school system. And he's like, well, that's not right. What else isn't? So he starts delving into it using the same methodology that he has been trained on to study everybody else's history, except for Israeli history or Judean history. And he does that. And he finds that there's a number of myths that are out there that are changing the paradigm about how people view this topic. And one of the big ones was, the one that we all grew up with, was that we were all descendants of that group that were kicked out of Judea. But people over here say Israel, right? They were kicked out of Israel back in the Roman times, and they were forced to wander around. And there's a number of reasons why that myth just kind of kept going. But as he clearly demonstrates in here, with a lot of other evidence and a lot of other researchers that are pretty good, majority of them from Tel Aviv University and some of the Israeli universities, and some others in European universities. But again, this is an Israeli scholar, and he's honest, intellectually honest. He's not Jewish because he rejects Judaism. He doesn't believe in a higher power. He believes that there's a God out there, but he doesn't think that there's any evidence of that coming in. So that's his perspective. So he's very much evidence-based approach, and he's not having to protect anybody's religious sensibilities, either Christian or Jewish. So what he found was that most of the Jews that are outside of Judea by about 300 to 400 to 600 AD are converts. The Judaic religion at the time, a contemporary with Christianity as well, the emergent Christianity, was very proselytizing. In fact, it occurred before, during the Hasmonean revolt. So if you're not Jewish, the Hanukkah, so Hanukkah lights, you've probably seen the menorahs and all that sort of, or the Hanukkahs and all that sort of thing out there. That's usually about Christmas time. In Kislev is when we celebrate it. And it's actually a 4th of July, right? So it's when the Maccabean, the Hasmonean dynasty came in and basically beat off the Seleucids, right? There was the Seleucid Greeks. It was one of the Greek generals that, after Alexander, took over the area, and they fought against them and reestablished pretty much home rule, right? So that was it. So it's kind of like 4th of July, kicking out the British. Well, it kicked out these Seleucid Greeks and, reestablished the temple. The Hasmonean dynasty put themselves in the temple, and they were kings, which violated Israeli or old Israeli law, Torah law, which says you had to separate, right? And they said, now we'll do it all in one office. And then they invited the Romans in to say, hey, keep us at bay from, everything else. And so that kind of led to what most Christians now remember is King Herod and that sort of thing. So it's a long story, but suffice to say that during the period of the Hasmonean, so you're looking at 100 to 200 years before the events that are told in what's called the New Testament or the Christian's New Testament. During that period, the Jews were proselytizing. In fact, one of the edicts that banned them from certain areas in Rome was because the kingdom of Judea with the Hasmoneans were giving royal titles to some Roman senators, and that was seen as subversive, right? It was like, hey, what are you doing? Stop. Yeah. Right. So there's a period of time where it's like, you can't be selling royal titles to the House of Hasmonean to Roman senators. You just don't do that. So that was a big shocker, right? Because nowadays we do have a prohibition against converting, right? So and even if someone comes up to a rabbi going, I want to be Jewish, the rabbi is by law supposed to dissuade him at least 3 times very seriously. And it's a serious process that you have to go through, right? Because in other words, it's like, nowadays it seems like, why would you want to do that? But in the olden days, which surprised me, which is in Shlomo Sand's book, Professor Sand's, it was the fact that, yes, here is a huge converting culture, right? They were out converting, they were proselytizing, there was a lot going on. And so most of everyone today is actually descendant of converts, right? From Greece, the Hellenic world. So you're either more the Roman world or the Hellenic world. The Hellenic world was more the intellectual. There was a lot of trade going on. Rome was more the administration. So you get people like Josephus, right, who were there that were more the administrators and that kind of thing. But if you're in the Greek area, it's more open merchants, things like that. And there was a lot of hybridization. The Jewish religion that we know today did not exist as we think of it back in those days. So up until about 300, 400, it was still very much in flux in the West, in the Hellenic world and in the Roman areas, right? That kind of thing. There was one empire, but it was a different flavor. In fact, he even uncovered there was a synagogue to Jupiter, right? So it's a it's a Hellenic Roman god, Jupiter, and there was a hybrid synagogue to that. So it was Jewish, but they said to Jupiter, which is forbidden now. You can't do that. So things changed over time, and people would convert from polytheism to Judaism. They would try Christianity. They would come back. So there was a lot of movement. It wasn't until after Constantine, when the Roman Empire shifted over and made Christianity an official religion, and then there was 9 edicts that prescribed the Jews from converting others, right? So you could not convert someone to Judaism, but that took 9 edicts to do that. And at that point, according to Professor Shlomo Sand, Tel Aviv University, they said, okay, now we need to do some internal controls because we don't want to get in trouble with a civil law. So we'll make it a community law, and now we'll say you can't go proselytize, and the rabbi's going to have to screen it. You better reject them 3 times because you could get in trouble with the authorities, right? So it wasn't something that was developed internally. It was internal for a safety measure because the external laws were there. That occurred in the Muslim occupied lands. So when Islam rose up about the 7th and 8th century and began to conquer those formerly Christian Roman areas, then eventually, after about 200 years, then the Islamics also began that because people were converting to Islam, and then they would start converting to Judaism, right? So then that culture of proselytization in the East, in the Middle Eastern lands, we call it now, that changed about that time. And over time, all of these different groups began to, again, move around. So if you were in Rome, you were able to move and migrate around Roman areas. When the Muslims took over, you were able to kind of move around depending on, the dynasty that was there. It was fairly easy travel to move around. And so various Jewish groups would go. And over time, then you began to see the cultures that we have today and the religion that we have today coalesce. In fact, Maimonides, the Ramban, used a lot of concepts from Islam, Tawhid, for example, Aristotelian logic. There's the Greek logic that the Arabs had come over. The Arab philosophers were using Aristotelian logic to redefine or define Islam and their concept of God. Maimonides, Ramban, who was in the Arabic world and wrote in Arabic, he took the concept of Tawhid, which was what is God, and then he wrote his 13 Principles of Faith. He began to recreate the Jewish concept of God. So the concept of Abraham's God and the concept of a Middle Ages, late Renaissance Jew in the West is going to be different. In fact, Maimonides was seen as heretical by many, many areas until later. And then eventually it was adopted. So now any group you go to within Judaism, Yeah, Maimonides, Rambam, 13 Principles. Yeah, we got this. And they actually, will support that. But it came much later. It was a response. It was incorporating Islam, and the 13 Principles of faith was actually one more than the Christians had in the 12 Apostle, the creed that the Catholic Church had, which was the church of Christians until 1000. And then there was an Eastern and a Western. And then, of course, the Reformation in the 1500s with Martin Luther. And then you have all different flavors, which brings me to my next topic, or my next point, the myth that needs to be dispelled. So the first part is Judaism is not a race. We're not a race. We're not even an ethnicity, right? There is no Jewish ethnicity. There is no Jewish race, right? And now, because of a lot of study by folks over there at Tel Aviv University, Shlomo Sands, we're not even really physically descendants of Abraham. And some Orthodox communities have been saying that for a while. They're like, well, it's spiritually, right? In the Shama, your soul was there at Har Sinai, and there it is. Why even a convert is considered, his soul was there, and it just took time, and it showed up in 19th century or 20th century, and that soul was at Har Sinai, and then it came here. So it's not a physical, it's not a genetic, it's in the Shama, right? In Jewish religious belief. But when the Enlightenment came, which was called Haskalah, the Jewish had a kosher Enlightenment called Haskalah in the West. They began to see things in terms of race and Darwinism and that sort of thing. So they couldn't say the neshama was what bound Jews together, right? The soul of this from Moses at Sinai. So they created this thing called race, and they said, well, it's for, and then they reinforced on an old minhag that said an old Gemara that said it's your mother that gives you that. And that wasn't even all communities. That was more in the West, because it was kind of easy to, it's in custody and all that sort of thing. Well, okay, we'll just keep it the mom and it'll be easy. And there's some tracks in the womb and that sort of thing. So that was a later evolution. It wasn't that way in the beginning. So understanding that, number one, not magic elf people. Number two, there is no Jewish race, culture, ethnicity, right? It's myriads. It's like saying there's a Christian race or even a Christian culture. There's different Christian cultures, right? Sun Young Moon, who says he's a Christian, is very different than Latter-day Saints, who say they're Christian, right? It's different than even Jim Jones. I think he was a Christian, right? It's different than the Catholic Church. Judaism has just as many disparate groups, and they argue. Even in the same group, like, for example, Satmars, they're the Satmars that are the more, even not pro-Palestinian, but they're the ones that'll fly over to Iran, and they'll fly down to Palestine, and they stand there and say, look, this is how aggressive we are. And then, not aggressive, but standing behind their principles, we're going to really, really show it. And the others that say, well, we're not going to do that, but we're not going to support Israel, right? And that's the Satmar group of Judaism. And then you have other Jews that are very pro-Zionist, pro-Israel. And there are Jews that believe in God. There are Jews that don't, which is funny, because only in the lens of a race or an ethnicity can you say I am Jewish. And that was recreated within the 19th, 20th century. So late 18th, 19th, 20th century, it became that, but it wasn't that in the beginning. So that's something that needs to be understood, is because that does not exist. And then I've noticed there's some people on here on live and different ones. I'm not quite sure if it's which system you're on, but if you have questions at any, type them in there. This is just a Shabbos talk, free. Go ahead and put your comments in there, and then we can talk about them also. Hopefully I'll be able to see them here. We'll see if we can keep that going. So those are the two myths that need to go away, right? So when people say, well, the Jewish, his mom was Jewish or that Jewish, well, technically a lot of the modern Jewish cultures, we do that. We'll say, okay, you're Jewish because your mom's Jewish. However, traditionally it hasn't been that way. And if you trace it back, at some point, your mom was a Greek or a Roman or a German tribesman or something like that. And this bears out with some of the studies on the Ashkenazic Jews, which is like, okay, they were in Germany from the Roman times, right? They had trading posts even in Britain, right? They were doing tin trading and things like that with Roman to move things around the Mediterranean. From Britain would go down, through Gibraltar, and they were settled in Britain. And some of them had converted, right, from Picts that were there in Britain already. They converted to Judaism during the early Roman period before Christianity became officially Roman, and some of them left, some of them stayed until everybody was booted out of England in 1200, I believe, 1245, I think was the date. Don't quote me on that one, but that's basically the first step that you have to understand. There is no Jewish race, there's no Jewish culture, there's no Jewish anything, right? The Jewish culture in New York is very different than the Jewish culture in British Columbia, Canada. Light years apart. Even Boston, you can tell a rabbi from Boston and a Chabad rabbi from Boston is different than New York, is different than British Columbia. Big difference, right? There's a little bit of culture, but big difference, right? Just think like Christians, right? All Christians aren't the same. There's a huge variety. There's no chief rabbi of that. In Christianity, you have a couple of groups that do have a hierarchy and that sort of thing. In Judaism, it's mostly the family. The Chabadniks will have the Haredi will have a rabbi, but everybody else, they kind of vote theirs in. The community votes in the rabbi, and then that's it. So, a synagogue, one of 20 or so in New York, will vote in their rabbi based on their community. Okay, it's their Reconstructionist, their Reform, their modern Orthodox, whatever they want to call themselves. It's that variation. They'll vote in a rabbi, and then the board will vote out a rabbi if they want to. Even Chabad communities, sometimes when they're outside the shlichus, they'll do the same thing. They'll vote out a rabbi. They'll vote in a rabbi. The community will. And so that's important to see. There's none of that. So a lot of the anti-Jewish things are the Jews. There's no the Jews. What are you talking about? It's varied. It's mixed. But the other thing is with the Zionists. So that's the anti-Jews, right? The kind of the ones that go against Jews and Judaism. They think it's a race. It's not. It's just a religion, right? There's no Buddhist race. There's no Christian race. It's just a religion, and it's a myth that has been built up over time in both camps, in Jewish camp and in the non-Jewish camp, that believes that, and it's wrong, right? It's not historically supported. The evidence is clear, at least unless something else comes up. But there's a lot there. Again, Shlomo Sand's invention of the Jewish people, very, very remarkable in that, and it falls back on a lot of what, for example, Rabbi Shapiro and a lot of the Hasids will say, which is, okay, it is a soul, it's a religion, it's a belief, it's a religion, right? And it's your soul that makes you Jewish, not your body, or that sort of thing. So keep that in mind. The second part is that there is no central structure within Judaism, right? People will say there's a lot of anti-Semitic things about this and that. It's not there. But the Zionists are also wrong. So the anti-Jewish are wrong. The Zionists are the same, because they have built it upon a race that needs to have this land. And as we talked about at the beginning, the land you weren't booted out of Israel. Nobody was booted out of Judea, right? Except the Bar Kokhba revolt folks and the people that were supposed to be keeping them under control. They were the ones that got booted out. Everybody else was there. And then they would trade, right? There's more money to be made up in Greece, or there's more money to be made in Sicily trading ports than there is right here in Judea, especially because the Romans are tearing down the temple, and it kind of is not a lot of economics going on here now. They migrate out, same as everybody else does. They go where the money is, right? So they're going to the New York of the day of the first, second, and third century. They're going where the money is. The trade lines are all the way up into the Black Sea. There are Jewish settlements in the Black Sea with converts. Back in the Hellenic age, they're just following those lines, right? There was a lot of converts within Rome that were going on. So that was occurring all the time, and it was consistent until the government said no. So when Constantine took over, 9 edicts from the Roman government that said you cannot convert to Judaism. And then Jews modified themselves in the West, in the Christian world. And then later in the Arabic conquest, they did similar in Arabic. Once there were certain laws in Arabia, eventually over time, with the same thing. Like, okay, once you've become Islamic, once you become Muslim, you can't retrograde. You can't go back to anything else. You can't go to Judaism. So they put those laws out, and then the Jewish modified it. So keep that in mind. And again, the Semitic, even then, there was a lot of converts. So anybody that was left in Judea that was Jewish, that was of the group of the Hasmonean dynasty or anything like that, they would have most likely, a lot of them, as Shlomo Sands pointed out, converted to Christianity during the Roman period. So Constantine, because there's economic benefits, there's social benefits, they converted to Christianity. And then when the Arabs took over, a lot of them converted to Muslims, but they were Christians, and they'd been Christians for 300-400 years. So they were Christians, right? And then they would convert to Islam, or some of them stayed Christian, or some of them stayed Jewish, right? And then others moved in that area from outside, but they were the sons and the descendants of Italians or Romans who had converted, or Parthians who had converted, or Germanics who had converted, or Gauls who had converted, or Picts who had converted, and then they all come back in. So this melange of the physical DNA is all over the place, right? It's what you believed and what you followed. And eventually, once the laws kind of put you in a restricted area, then you maintain that over time, because there's really not much opportunity to convert out of it once you were in it, depending on where you were and that sort of thing. So keep that in mind. So the Zionists are wrong because they say, well, here's the race that has to go into the sandbox, into Israel, modern day Israel. And that they believe that that's somehow genetically impaired or genetically predispositioned to be there. It's not true, right? In other words, your genetic ancestry is literally in France now because you were Gauls that converted, or you were in Greece, or you were up in the Black Sea area, or you were in what's now Germany or Austria or England or North Africa, Tunisia, or Persia, that sort of thing. So it doesn't make sense, right? It's a myth, and the problem is that people that understand it know it. For example, again, Shlomo Sands, It doesn't make sense, right? And even then, does everybody get to go home to wherever they were from? Um, I was in New Mexico recently, up in Gila, right? The Gila Hot Springs and area, and there's a Gila National Forest where the Apaches were. That was Apache country. In fact, the New Mexico flag has a circle, and then these four sets of different lines that go out, and that's a map of the representation of the four big Apache families that had in the Apache Nation, and then the center was kind of a neutral zone, and they believed it in their religion. Their Garden of Eden, because their Great Spirit put them down in that turf, which is the Gila National Forest, where like Geronimo was born and all that. And those are the Apaches, and they've been there since time immemorial. So it's equivalent to, okay, Adam and Eve come down the Garden of Eden, except they never ate the fruit and they never got banished. And then then they got kicked off. The Apache were kicked off by essentially settlers that came in there, right? So why don't we return the Apaches to their traditional land, right? In other words, we don't go around doing this for anyone else, right? So there's a reason for that, and that's what we're going to get into next. That's the political reason for why the West has really fixated on, for some reason, number one, there's a race that has to go back to the where they came from, which again, as we've seen, isn't true. You didn't come from there. You came from Germany. You came from France. You came from Britain, and a mix, right? Like everybody else. There's all kind of genetic mixing going on. So it's ridiculous. But why that belief took hold so strongly in the West and eventually began to corrupt and poison the Jewish communities so that they began to believe it as well. And I'll put this out very, very succinctly. It came from the Christians first. It didn't come from the Jewish community. The Jewish community could have always moved to the former Judea or Israel, right? So during any of the period, there were always Jews there. There were always yeshivas there, right? Houses of study. In fact, a lot of rabbis would go back to study in the land of the ancestors, to visit the tombs at Malkpeh. They would do these sorts of things, right? Where's Abraham's tomb? I'm going to go there. I'm going to go to these famous tombs. And it was a spiritual journey for them. You could always go there. You could always buy land. That was always continuity. It was never forbidden territory for a Jew to be there. Like I said, for 9 months, 8 to 9 months, right after the Bar Kokhba revolt, a circumcised man could not enter Jerusalem, but that's because the Romans were tearing down the temple and they wanted to calm everything down, but they never booted everybody out of Judea, right? It was just not the fact. And you could always move back to Judea. And that went all throughout history, even in the Ottoman Empire. So in the 1880s and 90s, when Theodor Herzl was convinced, you could go there and buy land, and so he went to the Sultan, Mehmet, I believe the fourth, and gave him the Zionist program. And Mehmet the fourth's like, I'm not going to force anybody out. I'm not going to make anything. But if you want to go buy land there, you go buy land there, right? There was never a prohibition for Jews to do it. There was a brief prohibition when the British imperialists, is what we'll talk about, when the Ottomans began to say, okay, the British fingerprints are all over this, and they've already grabbed Cyprus from us, and they've already grabbed some other turf from us. So yeah, we're going to kind of slow the roll here for anybody that wants to come in, because we're pretty sure the Brits are behind it. And that's what we'll talk about now. So the concept of Zionism is, there's a religious component into it, but that's very old. And it was always the Jewish perspective. The traditional religious Jewish perspective has been, we were kicked out of Israel, Judea. We were kicked out of Judea because we didn't follow the mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are laws, commandments. There's 613 of them, but not all of them apply to everybody because time, and some of them are the temple and some are only for Kohen or Levites. And so, but there's 613. And if you don't follow those, then you get kicked out. People forget this. They always talk, the chosen people and things like that. Well, the reality of it is that you are chosen, but you're chosen, right? It's like being a private or a sergeant, right? And the commander comes to you, hey, I've just chosen you for a great duty. And you're like, here we go. All right. This is going to be bad. And it was always it was a blessing and a curse. So even in our text, it says there is a blessing. I present before you this day, translating, there's a blessing and a curse. The blessing is, if you do the laws, you'll be in this land with milk and honey. It's going to be great. Your children will increase. Your enemies will be put before you. You're going to be fine, right? If you do the commandments. If you don't do the commandments, bye-bye, right? And what happened? We didn't do the commandments, right? And all throughout, I mean, even King David, right? Everybody's like, ooh, King David. King David was, he was beloved by the Lord and all that, but he violated so many commandments, it was ridiculous. He murdered his best friend to get to his wife, committing adultery, right? Not a big role model, even though David HaMelech is, this is David HaMelech. No, I mean, rationally, no. And Solomon began to worship idols. In fact, there was a period of time, don't forget, where when they were rebuilding the temple, they were reconstructing the temple, they found a Torah scroll and like, oh, this is what we're supposed to do. So they had a period of time, they didn't even know what the mitzvahs was, where the commandments were. So keep that in mind, is that, okay, the rules were broken. In other words, the promise to Abraham had already been violated, which meant that according to that covenant, if you're going to talk religious terms, right, that covenant with Abraham was already violated when you broke all the mitzvahs, when you failed to follow the mitzvahs and you began to worship idols, and you married foreign women and all this. Boom, you're done. Bye-bye. See ya. Right. And it was a grace. It was a nicety that you lasted that long up until the Romans. And even then you weren't booted off the land. It's not yours anymore. And the way that the way that many rabbis explain it, which is very good, the judge, God, has given you a sentence, right? In other words, the judge has given you a sentence, exile, galut, right? You're going to have to wander among there. And it's such time that when you figured out how to do the mitzvahs and you're responsible enough to come back and implement those mitzvahs in this land of Israel, Judea, then I will commute the sentence and you can come back. But the judge does that. Has that occurred in 1947? No. Right. And later on, that began the Mashiach, the Jewish concept of our Mashiach will come and he will lead the people back in. Right. But that didn't occur. Right. Who's the Mashiach? In other words, all the Christians that are sitting there, from Ted Cruz and all those guys that are like, oh, we got to support Israel. OK, who's the Messiah? Is it David Ben Gurion or is it Golda Meir? Whose statue are you now going to put up on a cross? Because that's what the Christians think. Right. In other words, if you believe the Bible, the Mashiach is the one that's going to lead them back, and it creates the better world and leads the Jews back home. After the sentence is commuted, after there's peace on earth, after the Jewish community all over the world is in the diaspora, has learned to do the mitzvahs, can get along, and finally follows all the mitzvahs, which we didn't do during the Judean period, right? So if that's occurred, and this Israel is the biblical Israel, right, as Ted Cruz seems to think, and all those weirdos on the panel that it was a couple of days ago, right? Okay, well, who are you putting on your cross? Is it Golda Meir or is it Ben Gurion? Who? Because that's the Messiah, because that's what you're saying, right? It doesn't make sense. So that's the next point, is that according to traditional Judaism, when this happens, then the judge commutes your sentence, and then you can go back. What we have done in this side, which very much angered a lot of Jews, was the Christians wanted to get the cart before the horse. They said, don't worry, we're gonna put you back in, and then the judge will be forced to commute the sentence. And in Judaism, you don't do that. What are you forcing God? You can argue with him, but you're not going to force him to do anything, right? That's heretical. We got kids. It doesn't make sense. And that's the problem, is that the Christian view of what this was supposed to be, they were forcing Jews to go back to Israel in order for them to have their Messiah come. They were forcing the end times. Now, people don't realize that occurred, but it did, and we have documentation of that. But it's not the Jewish concept. It's not the traditional Jewish concept. We don't have that concept, right? And over time, depending on the group, we even have different Mashiachs. We have a Messiah, I should say. Mashiach is our pronunciation for it. There's a Messiah ben David, the Moshiach ben David, and a Moshiach ben Aaron. And depending on the tradition, again, there's no standard Judaism. There's no chief rabbi. There's none of this stuff. It's very different. So under the Mashiach ben David, that's if you've done well, you did a great job, you're going to get this general that's going to lead you in strength back to Israel. But if you didn't, you're going to need a softer touch, and that's Moshiach ben Aaron. And it's going to be better, but you're not going to have a lot of power in that. It's just to be like, okay, here's your reprieve, but it's not going to be coming back with parades or anything, but I'm going to let you back in. So that depends, and you're going to earn what type of Mashiach you're going to have, right? So that's the concept. But again, God, the judge, will set up when you go back. The Christian, the dispensationalists, not all Christians, but this group of Christians that were in Britain created something, and it was a guy named Darby, and there was a few others in there. There was Oliphant, and they were in Britain, and they were in more of the Presbyterian realm in Scotland, who believed themselves to be part of the 10 lost tribes. Some of them did, not all of them. And they began to create something called dispensationalism. And it's where you put basically the cart before the horse, and you say, we're going to move the Jews back to Israel, and that will set about the second coming. And if you read the rest of their dispensationalism material, in the Scofield Bible especially, they literally just scrambled everything that was already in the Christian New Testament. They scrambled and omitted words that was insane. And basically, the punchline of this is that the Jews will then convert, and if they don't, then they all die off. So, hey, don't do me any favors, buddy. So that's kind of where that came from. And the reason it became powerful, but instead of just being a weird cult that was over there in some areas in Britain, the reason it became powerful was because of geopolitics, because of routes and resources. If you look at where Judea was, if you look at where Israel is now, It was right there in the Suez Canal. What was built, starting to be built in the 1850s, complete 1860s, right, with Ferdinand de Lesseps, was the Suez Canal. And it was the most powerful piece of real estate, the most important piece of real estate in the world for decades, right? And when it was built, it was absolutely powerful and absolutely essential to the British Empire that needed to be able to move its resources from India and Southeast Asia and Africa on this side of Africa, right, the east side of Africa, up into the rest of its areas, right, without having to go all the way around the world and some very dangerous areas. The French built it. The British were like, no, that's going to be ours. The first thing they did was economics. So the Egyptians had to give up their share of it. So it was then jointly owned stock company between the British and the French, and then they forced the French out, and because they just basically took over Egypt later on. So they owned Egypt. They now, by default, own the canal. The British do, but they need to guard the flank of the canal because what's right there? The Ottoman Empire. So here, take a look at the map. Fortunately, I don't have it here, but take a look at the map. Look at the Suez Canal, right? You have Egypt, and now you have the Sinai, and then you have Israel, right? Israel in those days and part of the Sinai was Ottoman Empire. In fact, Egypt had been Ottoman Empire, and they Muhammad Ali actually had separated from them. It was a separate state for a while, aligned with the Ottomans, but it became more independent as time went on. But Britain knew it had to buffer out, move out the Ottomans and move in something secure to secure that eastern flank of their Suez Canal. Otherwise, it's dangerous. And it became more so in the 1870s, 80s, 90s because Germany unified 1871 and began by the 1880s to become an economic powerhouse, severely competing technologically and industrially with Britain. And they couldn't keep up. They couldn't master the industrial base or the quality that the new Germany was doing, because Germany, again, 1871, and Germany, especially Kaiser Wilhelm II, the grandson of Queen Elizabeth, was fast friends with the Ottomans. He loved the Ottomans. The Germans just got along with him, and Britain had been, depending on when you're looking at it, at war with them, and they had taken parts of Cyprus. I mean, they were carving out what they could, and so that would have been a German ally right on the border with a huge land and sea border with the Suez Canal. They could have closed out the Suez Canal, right? You got to keep those trade lines open. And at about that same time, dispensationalism, which is a Christian Zionism, which that's where it started, because again, Jews could always go and buy land. And there were like I said, there was yeshivas. There were Jews already living in what's now Israel, right? Back then, the Ottoman Palestine, they were there. And some communities had been there for hundreds of years, right? Right. The Samaritans actually, this is a debatable topic, but Samaritans are probably Israelis because there's two separate kingdoms, Judea and Israel, and they've been there forever. They have the same Torah. The only difference is theirs is Mount Gerizim and ours is Mount Sinai. That's it, right? Other than that, it's the same Torah. But they were the northern kingdom. Jews today mostly see the southern kingdom, but Samaritans had been there, right? So in other words, you could always go there. Why was it necessary to force to carve out this other thing? It didn't make any sense. So if you as a Jew felt religiously obligated to go to the land of Israel, you could always do that. It was always available for you, right? It was not banned until a little bit later when the British started pushing this. And then for a brief time, the Ottomans were like, hey, slow the roll. We're going to have to screen these folks coming in here because they may be British colonials. And they were. So what happened was that the British began to move this. And Oliphant went, he talked to the Sultan. Sultan's like, he began to try to push this, and he realized that he himself and a guy named Oliphant, who had worked with Darby in creating dispensationalism, they actually tried. Oliphant tried to make a little colony for Jews. He was setting up these little areas within the Ottoman-ruled Judea. He's like, "Come on over, this is great." And no, it's like, why? We have Berlin, we have Vienna, and now we have New York. What, are you crazy? Why would we go to a sandbox? It doesn't make any sense. So the Jews themselves in those days did not want to go back, except a few that at that time were religious, and then later on, the Jews that were under Tsarist Russia, because it was so oppressive in Russia, tremendously oppressive, even through the Soviet years. So let's dispel that other myth. The Jews that were in Tsarist Russia, they were still being literally pogromed during the Soviet years, right? So, get rid of that nonsense. But they wanted to go somewhere, and they were radicalized because a lot of them had left the shtetl mindset. They weren't religious. They were secular socialists. And if you didn't join the Bund, you had kind of a Marxist mindset. So there's the religious, the Haredi. It kind of broke down like this in Russia. There's the religious Haredi, which they embraced the shtetlism because that allowed them to set up the laws around them, and you lived as a community of Jews in your isolation, which worked well for being able to maintain the mitzvahs. Then there were those that were radicalized, and anything against the czar. And because socialism began to be an anti-czarist kind of a movement in Russia, a lot of them glomped onto that. And then there were those that in the Bund that said, well, we don't like this communism crap, but we're going to have good labor relations like a big union gang. So they would go beat up the communists and they go beat up, the czarist. So it was a different mix, melange there. But that group of the socialists in Russia, the Jewish socialists, they were kind of like, hey, we'll set up a colony, a little kibbutzim down here, and make a socialist paradise. But it wasn't religious based. The first Aliyah that was going down there was not religious; it was secular. It was political and secular, and they were the ones that were kind of pushing this. Now everybody points to Theodor Herzl, right? Theodor Herzl is the George Washington of Zionism. He didn't like anti-Semitism because what happened in France, the Alfred Dreyfus affair, 1880s. And so he said, well, we're never going to integrate. This is horrible. He wrote books on it, so we know what he thought. He wrote books on it and was very, very articulate about what this was going. So he says that initially he was going to have everybody convert to Catholicism. It was going to be a big thing in Vienna. That was his thing. He was going to convince most of the Jewish community to go to Vienna, to this big cathedral, big public show, convert to Catholicism, and that'll prove that Jews can integrate, because he bought into the whole racial thing. He wasn't very religious at all. So he bought into the racial theory. But how do we prove we as a race can coexist with the other races, the Austrian race and the German race and the British race? How do we do this? And he was going to convert to Catholicism. And he was talked out of that shortly after one of the Oliphant, the British group, went and talked to him. And then he said, oh, okay. And he had been debating about a homeland for the Jews, because everybody else in those days when nationalism was creating these homelands, right? The Germans had just set up the Germanic homeland. Italy with Garibaldi was setting up Italian homeland, right? Whereas before, these were all different states. They spoke the same language. So he began to say, well, we can do the same for Jews. And he has to create a Jewish culture, because there isn't one. He has to create a new language. He destroyed, or he refused to use Yiddish, which was kind of the lingua franca of most Ashkenazi Jews. Huge Yiddishkeit culture. It was amazing, right? So the Germans, what we call high society German Jews, could talk to the Ostjuden, which were in Russia, which were typically the more poor Jews, through Yiddish, right? So they could do trade, they could do agreements, because there was a language in common, right? So if someone from Russia that didn't speak German, they were at a disadvantage, because the lower class Ostjuden, or the Russian Jew, could go talk to his rich cousin in Germany in the same language, roughly. About 80% they'll understand. Herzl created Hebrew, the language of Hebrew. He reinvented it, right? Because Hebrew was a biblical language. You would speak Hebrew. The prayers are in Hebrew, but also in Aramaic, and then a lot of times Yiddish in that region. Ladino in other places, and Arabic in other places. But he had to reinvigorate Hebrew, but he lowered it. Hebrew was always the religious language. It was language of Torah, and that was seen as that was that language. But now he's using things like, well, I have to invent the word for toilet. I have to invent the word for pedophile. I have to invent the word for all. So he decreased the language. So a lot of rabbis were very upset, because he has now made it a guttural, everyday language, right? It's what it should have been, a holy language. So that began to destroy Jewish culture, right? So that's the unsung thing that most people don't talk about, is Theodor Herzl, in reviving Hebrew, destroyed a big part of Jewish culture, because the Hebrew language was holy. Now it's just common. It's a guttural language, right? Your common agnostic, atheistic thief, rapist is using it, right? So, it's not good. And that sort of thing. And then he began to destroy over time. And then Israel really destroyed a lot of Yiddishkeit. Also, the Nazis destroyed Yiddish as a language, right? They killed off everybody who was using Yiddish. So that entire, history and culture and literature and culture, that was destroyed, right? And not just by Nazis. It was destroyed partly by Theodor Herzl, and then again partly by the Israeli government, who didn't want people using Yiddish when they moved to Israel. They wanted this invented language of Hebrew, right? Which was supposed to only be for Torah and holiness, but now it's guttural, it's pedestrian, it's not holy anymore. So that was one issue. But Theodor Herzl was talked to by the British, because they wanted what they felt was going to be a group of people, the Jews, who would be able to settle and develop that area, but they would be loyal to the Brits, very thankful to the Brits. They even said it. They're going to be grateful to us because we've led them to this promised land, because the dispensationalists thought this was religious. They couldn't understand why the Jews didn't think the same, because they didn't understand Judaism. They didn't understand religious Judaism. They talked to Herzl. He's an atheist. He doesn't believe in religion, right? So he's like, oh, Israel, great idea. I can have this land to myself, and it's kind of historical. So that's his idea. and they see his excitement, his energy. They go back home to London. They start, hey, this is great, Rothschild. Let's get some money on this. And Rothschild's not. They married into Christian. They were all over the place, right? They had long stopped being purely Jewish group, right? And they're like, well, okay, defend the Suez Canal. Yeah, okay, we'll finance it. So they began to do all this kind of movement, but they couldn't get any Jews to go. Just wasn't happening, right? The first Aliyah had, I think it was like 30,000. And it was mostly just these early pioneers. The second Aliyah was about 30,000. That's where David Ben Gurion was part of that. And they were very socialistic. They were like left-wing socialist atheists, right? And they go and they're going to make it work. And about 2/3 of them left after about 5 to 10 years. They're gone. They went to New York or Vienna or Berlin. They're like, no, right? But those that stayed became kind of that hardcore group that they're going to make this work. But it wasn't because it was religious. It wasn't because it was Jewish. It was because they believed themselves to be a separate group, ethnicity, race called Judaism, because that was what formed out of the halacha that was converted by the Haskalah, the kosher enlightenment that occurred just after the Western Enlightenment. And they believed in this racial thing that had been imposed from outside that didn't reflect any historical fact. So those were the kind of the true believers, the starry-eyed socialists that were hanging out there. They were the ones from the second Aliyah that kind of formed the base. But nobody was going. And in fact, they were funding for getting people out of Russia because it was horrible in Russia for Jews, and try to get them down there. But the first thing they would do, they would either go to Galicia, which was a huge Jewish refugee settlement in Austro-Hungary, or if you had money, you would go to Vienna or Berlin. But so many Ostjuden Russian Jews were coming to Berlin that the German Jews in Berlin were like, no. And so there was a guy named Albert Ballin, who was a billionaire, nowadays would be a trillionaire, but he owned the German-American, the Hamburg shipping line. So he had tons of money and he had ships. So, I mean, this guy was huge, right? He dined with the Kaiser, he was best friends with Kaiser Wilhelm II. I mean, he was like the Bill Gates, I don't use the word Bill Gates. He's like the Elon Musk of Germany at the time. And all these refugees start coming in. He's like, boy, they make us look bad. They didn't like the Ostjuden. So he's like, I'm going to give you subsidized passage on my German-American shipping line, and you're going to find this wonderful place called New York. So these are the German Jews, move along, let's go to New York. And funny that people forget this. The Statue of Liberty, the poem at the bottom, it's not designed for everybody out there. Give me your poor, you're tired, your huddled masses yearning to be free. That came from a Jewish Sephardic girl who was trying to convince her Sephardic social circle in New York to accept the Ostjuden, the Ashkenazic, the Slavic, Russian Jews that were coming over because they were culturally so different, right? It was like different world, different nation, different peoples, completely different. And they clashed. And she's like, no, kumbaya, we're all good. And she wrote that and it won, and then ended up in the Statue of Liberty. But it was basically trying to convince the Sephardic and the German Jews that were in New York that, okay, we need to take these Jewish refugees from Russia. And the Jews that were here were like, same as the German Jews did in Germany. They're like, we don't want these Russian Jews. They're different. It's totally different. And so there's culture clashes even within Judaism. It's not monotheistic. It's not a monoculture. It doesn't work, right? There's huge debates there. And the war actually brought them out. When you had two groups of Jews from different areas that would have to come together, they were fighting each other more than anything else. And the guards could just sit back and watch them fight. I mean, it was pretty bad. Some interesting letters, for example, out of the Shanghai ghetto when the refugees went over there, but we won't go into that. So suffice to say that during this period of time, nobody was going to Israel. It wasn't until, unfortunately, the Holocaust, until the Shoah, where at that point, when the rise of Hitler came up, right, and he was a stateless migrant from Austria-Hungary. He dodged the draft twice. Let's tell him what he is, call him what he is. He dodged the draft twice. He hooked up with his boyfriend in, I believe it was Munich, but don't quote me on that. It was Heidelberg or Munich. But anyway, his boyfriend got the urge to join the military, and so the boyfriend joined. Hitler followed him, right? So it was that. But everybody in his unit knew he was a Fagala, right? So there's lots of documentation on that. But he was a stateless migrant. And then he came in, and the first thing he was doing was these laws against the Germans. So here's a stateless migrant coming in, doing racial laws against the Germans, who, even though their religion was Jewish, had been ethnically and DNA German for centuries, right? Because they were either migrating up with the Germans, they were German converts before the laws of Rome said you couldn't be after about 300 years. So it doesn't make sense. But that created the emergency where now it comes in there. At the same time, there were, in the United States, for example, there was the Evian Conference. People forget Golda Meir was actually there at the Evian Conference, where Hitler said, okay, I'm gonna get rid of their state. They're going to be stateless migrants, just like he was, right? I'm going to get rid of the German citizenship for Jews. Who wants them? And the Evian conference was all the nations except like Japan, because Japan was trying to get them into Manchuria. But the United States, Britain, all the colonies of Britain, nobody, no, and a few countries in South America, I think Venezuela said we'll take a few. I think Brazil said they'll take a few, but everybody else was like no. But that was the moment they could have said, "Yeah, come on in." Like Canada, like Australia, you got a bunch in Australia. There were African colonies all over that Britain had, right? Why didn't Britain just move them down there? It was almost because Britain needed this huge population push. And it was interesting because a lot of people pushing and financing some of the canal, the Suez Canal, were the same ones that were financing those five gigantic companies in Germany that supplied money to the Junkers, the huge conglomerates in Germany that supplied money to the Nazi Party in 1930, 31, 32 timeframe, and gave them that huge war chest where they could start bribing and buying votes and that kind of thing. So, I'm not going to draw a line directly, but there is evidence to kind of push that there. And to show you, another thing was the United States could have taken them in, but this guy right here, his name is I don't want to call him rabbi, even though he's got that term. He's a horrible, horrible human being, and may his name be cursed forever. But Stephen Wise, Rabbi Stephen Wise, and he was FDR's token Jew. Morgenthau was the actual Jew, but this guy was the one that was supposed to keep all the American Jews in line to go along with socialism. And there was a huge push to have the United States could have helped, right? In other words, there's places that need to be developed. We can move it over there. The Japanese actually came to him and said, "We'll take every Jew from Germany, Austria, Hungary, bring them on over, or Austria. We'll bring them on over. We'll put them in Manchuria right away, right? Because Manchuria was going gangbusters, developing. It was safe at the time, and it was like, hey, and he's like, no." he put a kibosh on it. A few were able to get to escape to Harbin and set up some Jewish communes out there, or communities and stuff, this sort of thing. But no, he was totally against it, and he was Rabbi Stephen Wise. So he was pushing all the Jews to stay in a kill box, even after the war started, and even after the intelligence started coming in that there were some death camps that were there. He forbid and was literally sabotaging groups that were trying to get Americans mobilized together with resources to put rescue missions over there to get them out of the areas where they knew they were starting to collect Jews up. In other words, he was like, no. So the evidence is absolutely there that he was pushing for a kill box, right? That's just what it is. And so after the war, because of a conscientious of keeping Jews in a kill box, which was Europe, under the Nazi occupation, that created the emergency. That then there was this huge refugee crisis. But even then, a lot of the Jews wanted to go to New York. They didn't want to go to Israel. They want to go to New York, right? It was like, but the America's like, no. And it talks about that in here. The other part was there was a huge, so we talked to religion, right? Why the religious Jews, the very Orthodox Jews, were very much involved in saying, no, we're not going to, we don't want Israel, because God had made the decision that we have to be in exile, and we can't start up a state until God, sends the Messiah, and then we can go back. Who's the Messiah? Golda Meir, Theodore Herzl, David Ben-Gurion. Come on. So that's the issue. That's one issue. But then the reform, there was a huge group of Jewish migrants that came to America, German Jewish migrants. That was the majority of American Jewish community until the Russian Jews started coming over. And that was Albert Ballin of Hamburg American Shipping Line sending them over here with subsidized steamer passages. But basically, the majority of Jews in America were German Jews, and they were predominantly Reform. They came over after the 1848-52 revolutions in Europe. They came over, so they're very much, like the German migrants that were here, Germanic migrants. There was no Germany until 1871, but a majority of them were very much involved in American. Initially abolition. So they were part of the big abolitionist movements, just like the German immigrants. They were huge into the culture. In fact, many people couldn't differentiate between the German Christians and the German Jews until it became either Saturday or Sunday. They said, okay, Saturday they weren't showing up for work. Okay, that's a Jewish guy. And Sunday he's not showing up for work. Okay, so he's the Christian guy, right? So that was the Reform movement in a nutshell. But they were very much opposed to Zionism, even after the war, right? And they were working very hard to get the Jews that didn't want to get resettled back in West Germany or France, or, they couldn't because of the communism, right? So half of the areas where most of the Jews were was now under Soviet control, and America's just, the Iron Curtain's coming down. It's like, they're not going home. It's a bad op. But they were very much involved in that. This is the Reform Jewish side, and it was more intellectual. And I'll have to explain this. So the Orthodox and the Hasid and the Haredi, they were like, okay, when the judge decides, that's it. So don't talk to me until that time, right? We messed up the mitzvahs and that. So they're talking in those terms. But these guys were talking more in the terms of society and diplomacy and that sort of thing, and talking really in the terms of more the Enlightenment and how we would see things. And they even said, well, why us among all of the other nations are so unstable that we have to go to our own special place? Why are we so tender and delicate that we can't survive in the big boy world of modernity, right? Why do we have to go to the sandbox? It doesn't make sense, right? Even Einstein was eventually turned against the whole Zionist project because he's like, this is horrible. And it sets the Jews as a different group entirely, and then literally casts them as the bad guys because you got to kick somebody out in order to take this place when you maybe never been there. And even let's say you were one of the rare ones that DNA came from, from the Judeans. It's been 2,000 years. Well, the Apaches have only been off their land for, I don't know, 100. Why don't we put the Apaches back in New Mexico, right? Give them their land back, right? See, in other words, that just opens up a whole can of worms, and it creates a double standard, which then creates the tension, which then creates the potential for violence. And that's the big deal, is there's a double standard that was set up that even the Jews, right? Even the majority of American Jews were like, no, this is bad. And then Stephen Wise, remember this horrible person over here, who was FDR's little puppet, he began to change. He was doing the long march through the institutions, much as religions getting destroyed. So a lot of the Christians now are seeing their religions being destroyed from within, right? Groups coming within and changing the religious belief system. Wise was coming into the American Reform movement and changing it. So the American Reform movement now looks nothing like the American Reform movement, of the early 20th century. It's a very different animal, so to speak. And I came from Reform. I mean, my Reform was my early years was Reform. It looks very different. So this was the American Council for Judaism. So much so that many Reform rabbis were like, this is a terrible idea. They actually created, and this kind of goes against some of what the Jewish community is supposed to do. We're not supposed to fight publicly, but they said this is just so important. We have to create a committee, and fight openly against this and lobby just like a political group. This is terrible. And so the American Council for Judaism was created. It was tens of thousands. Some argue, depending on the membership, could be 100,000 or more of Jews from the mostly Reform movement, but there were some Orthodox in there and some non, like Albert Einstein, said, no, this is terrible. We can't do this. And again, ask yourself this question, right? Why? And I ask people this when they're like, oh, hey, great for Israel. It's like, well, what is it about me intrinsically, no matter what my individual skill set is? There's something in my DNA that you think I cannot exist in America, or I can't exist in a modern Western nation, that I'm just incapable of taking care of myself. And I'm unlike anybody else, that I have to be put on a reservation, right? Or concentration camp, for another word, right? In the sandbox. And more Jews have died in Israel since 1947 than have died outside of Israel. So if it was supposed to be safer, it's demonstrably false, right? Are there attacks against Jews? Yeah. But go to India, there's attacks against, the Sikhs are at each other's throats. The Sikhs and the Hindus and the Muslims are at each other's throats. Look at Pakistan and India. They were brothers until 70 years ago, when the British, Mountbatten had that little separate, but they were neighbors. They literally saw themselves as the same. They were Indians. And then they created this imagined state of Pakistan, and then suddenly they're enemies, right? The same process is going on, right? The same process. And again, I would ask Ted Cruz, I would ask all those guys that say, you have to be, it's the safety, it's survival, it's this. Okay, so what is it about us that you can't survive anywhere else, right? And again, genetically, thanks to Shlomo Sands, his remarkable studies very much proven it. It convinced me. I'm unless something else remarkable comes out that counteracts that, but I don't know how they're going to do that. We're from the same genetic stock as everybody else, right? It's just sometime in our history, somebody decided the laws of Moses are the way to go and converted and stayed with it. Or they married into a family that were traders that came up, or, merchants, not traders, but, economic traders that came up, and they intermarried and all that sort of thing before, they converted in through marriage and through, friendships and alliances and things like that. So, it doesn't make sense. In other words, do you think so low of Jews? So to be actual in their words, anti-Semitic, but it's really anti-Jewish, you think that the Jews are so incapable of doing anything, they have to be in a reservation in the sandbox, in this very contested area, in this very unsafe area, in a very volatile region, guarding the flank of a canal that they don't own. It's for other interests that they're guarding it, right? You make this militarized eastern flank. And again, look at 1956 war. right? Look at Britain, France, and the intercepts that are now declassified between Britain, France, and Israel. Britain calls up Israel and says, hey, go attack Egypt so we can jump in there and get the canal from Nasser, who just nationalized it, right? It's political. And the problem is when they try to create this myth that it's religious, or this myth that is the chosen land and all this sort of thing. No, it's not. In other words, on the intellectual level, the scientifically proven level, no. Historical level, no. On the religious level, on a moral level that we all use for everybody else in modern society, the modern, I hate to use the word liberal, but modern liberal society, right? No, it doesn't hold up water either, right? And then on the political side, only what's left is the political, right? Because nothing else holds up. It doesn't hold up to history. It doesn't hold up to morals. It only holds up to a political, a geopolitical scheme. And then the British could become Pied Pipers because they got all the Jews out of Europe. We saved Europe because they're all gone, like a Pied Piper, and they're over in the reservation, right? The same thing with the Indians. Move them into reservations. That's where they can survive, right? Keep them on the plantation. They can't handle them. They can't handle life outside the plantation. We saw this after the Civil War. Even after the emancipation of the Civil War, you have the same mindset that the Black Americans would be unable to take care of themselves, so they had to be in special areas and specially taken care of. That's kind of what's happening with the whole concept of Zionism, that Jews can't exist in the modern world. They can only exist in a small reservation sandbox where they were 2,000 years ago. They've not evolved societal since then. They can only survive and live there. Makes no sense, right? And if you're not safe in America being any religion, that's wrong. And that's where this Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick screwed up. Is because he booted the lady off. It's like, why are we talking Zionism? It's religion. It doesn't have shit to do with Israel. It doesn't have shit to do with that. That's something completely separate. It's not religion. The Jewish religion is here, right? And my religion specifically knows and sees, because I believe she said Catholic. So her religion specifically says, this is not the way to go, right? And it's, we protect Jews, but Israel has nothing to do. The modern state of Israel has nothing to do with Jews, other than it's a reservation for them, and it destroys the Jewish traditionals, a lot of traditional Jewish cultures. It wiped out Yiddishkeit, wiped out Yiddish language, wiped out Falashas, wiped out a lot of Yemenite culture, and then it rebrands in its own way, right? Kind of like the CCP way or the Soviet way of, cultural renovation. And right now they're fighting the Haredi, right? So the Orthodox go there, and Orthodox say, if you're a student at yeshiva, you don't get drafted, right? Unless it's a defensive war and like everybody, we're going to die here. Okay, now you're going to go. But anything outside of the territory, you don't do it. And the government of Israel has drafted them now. So no, you don't have any deferments anymore, right? And that destroys the Jewish religion. That destroys the Jewish religious culture. And it never was about it. They'll use the words, but it's a sales technique for people that don't know the history and people that aren't really well versed in Judaism. So that's the point. Is that yes, make sure I get her name right. I'm probably mispronouncing her name, but basically the Carrie Perjane Bowler said nothing that's quote unquote anti-Semitic. And again, we know that's not a word. So let's say it's anti-Judaism, Jewish. It's not. It's absolutely not. What she said was, in my religion, we do not recognize Zionism, right? And that's a religious thing, because Israel specifically and the religious Zionism, the older Christian Zionism, is very specific that these acts will occur and then this will happen. And this is cart before the horse. And he's making a decision on a religious ground. And he, by his booting her off, has in a different way, has basically said, we're going to define what religion is. So it's not a religious freedom council. It's actually defining religion in a new way by other means. So from a Jewish perspective, don't do that. Oh, here we go. Hey, Black Wolf is on. Look at that. What were those? Oh, that's those little, is that a Japanese thing? I don't know what that is. Anyway, that's very cute. Oh, congratulations, by the way, Black Wolf, on the new edition there. So I'm surprised you're online there, unless you've already trained your second daughter there how to type. Which anyway, knowing how smart she is, you probably could do it. But again, that's the problem is, again, that double standard comes in there. And when you have those double standards, you will have a development of anti-Jewish belief, because there is the double standard and it's become very obvious. And again, the problem is the destruction of Judaism by the government. For example, like I said, drafting the yeshiva students, wiping out Yiddishkeit. They've knocked out subsidies for the yeshivas that were there, even though they said they were going to do it. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So just recognize the fact that Jews are human and diverse as everybody else on this planet. They're just as human as everybody else. They're not magic elf people. We're not that. And that goes a long way, right? It's not a solid culture. There's many different myriads, just like everybody else in the world. But the problem is mostly non-Jews have been pushing this myth. And that has been a massive problem now, because when people go wrong, when Israel acts like a normal secular nation, which it is, people think in terms of religion, in terms of this belief that they have about a religion. But Israel's not a religious nation. It's not. There's no laws of Torah there, right? That's the issue. And so the problem is in that illusion. When that illusion gets shattered, people get upset because it's their religion. And the Christian dispensationalists are big on that. Oh, one more thing I want to talk about with history. So Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, is a member in the Houston, one of these Houston churches. It's a Baptist church. And they are actually being sued because there was actually a coup in there. He's a guest pastor, I think they called him. But basically, they were getting sued because it was taken over. In 2025, there's a lawsuit, April 2025, from something called the Jeremiah Council Corporation, that says that the guys that are running the Second Baptist Church in Houston, and again, that's where this Chief Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is, that made this decision, to define Jews the way he wants it. The lawsuit's filed, and the assets that the church has is $1 billion. A church has $1 billion in assets. And that's what they're arguing, because two guys, they're saying Pastor Edward Young and his son Ben Young took over, and basically they did a coup. They took over, and there's no more council that the church votes on. They have a committee that votes on things and all that. They just took over. And they have 90,000 members and $1 billion in assets. And once they took over, apparently a lot of people are upset because they said that you have to go walk by them as they're up in the pulpit, and you have to walk by them as you leave, and they have a basket out there for money, and they're just looking at you. So I mean, that's where he comes from, this kind of totalitarian background. So why would we expect him to actually be kind of generous and all that sort of thing? I wish it meant magical elf people. Yeah. So, and that's the part, is that the problem is with the political. If you leave the politics out, these huge political things, you can live in your religion, right? In other words, if the religion isn't harming anybody, there's nothing going on, or in the name of your religion, bad things are happening. You can live in that religion, and it's great. It's wonderful, right? In other words, that's a great thing. We all want the Tevye from was it Fiddler on the Roof? The shtetl, the imagined shtetl community. But the reality is that when politics intrudes in religion and religion intrudes on politics, it takes on a life of its own. And it usually ends up being violent, because it's a mechanism of control. It's a mechanism of contesting. It's a mechanism of kind of bypassing sometimes the actual issues of the mechanisms of the organizational structures to take it outside of that. And that's part of it. So yeah, I mean, it'd be nice, but there we go. Oh, let's see what that jumped to the stream late, but I never even knew Israel was created the way it was. Yeah, a lot of people don't. So going back to Theodore Herzl, like I was saying before, this one. So a lot of Jews out of Europe could have been rescued and taken to places like Australia, Africa, South America. Actually want them, and the U.S. could have facilitated it. But this guy, Stephen Wise, who was, like I said, it was FDR's little puppet guy. There's a tremendous documentation where he was literally stopping the ability of people to mobilize resources here to go help the Jews, even as the war was beginning to go on, and people were knowing what was coming. The intel was coming back that yes, some of them are going to death camps as bad. He was actually stopping groups here from organizing. He would go in and speak out against it. Like, we don't need to upset the administration. But what does rescuing Jews have to do with embarrassing FDR, right? In other words, what's going on here, right? So it's pretty bad. The Japanese went to him. I forgot, this is Colonel Ishii, I believe, went to him in New York and said, hey, I need your help. We will take all of the stateless Jews into Manchuria, right, in Harbin, because there already was Dr. Abraham Kaufman there with the Beit Israel project, right? They were going to create pretty much a Jewish community in Manchuria around Harbin area to be able to kind of facilitate that. And the Japanese were like, bring them, because they're trying to settle Harbin. It was the Wild West of Asia at that time, and they needed settlers, right? Just like the American West did. And he refused it. He absolutely and he went around and said, nobody talk to the Japanese, nobody do anything. How many millions of people did this guy kill with his decisions for some political thing, right? He wasn't saving Jews, but yet there's the Rabbi Weiss Center in New York. There's all sorts of foundations, and but he's really a horrible man when you actually look at his record. And that was part of it. The other part was Theodor Herzl, who, and I'm going back over it, so apologies for the people that heard this before, but it's an important point. Theodor Herzl, the George Washington of Israel, right, was atheistic. He didn't believe in religious Judaism. His idea was everybody convert publicly to Christianity in Vienna, Austria, and that would offset what he called anti-Semitism. It's anti-Judaism, but anti-Semitism, because he saw it as a race. He didn't see it as a religion. But then he was convinced by some British guys that were part of Oliphant's circle, which created, remember, the British Christians created dispensationalism, which is Jews have to go to Israel before the second coming, before the end times and heaven on earth and all that. But at the end of the story, all the Jews that don't convert die. So but they're going to force God to do that, right? But the Bible says that, and depending on what version you read, the end times come, then a Messiah comes, then the Jews go back to Israel. And in the Jewish version, it's the Jewish Messiah will lead them back into Israel after the peace is achieved. In the Christian version, okay, now there's a new kingdom of heaven and earth in Israel, and then the Jews go there and then they convert. So that sort of thing. But he was getting the cart before the horse, and these guys from Britain went to go see Theodor Herzl in Vienna. And after that, now he's all promoting, let's go down to Israel, which is Judea or Palestine at that point, in Ottoman Empire. And that sort of thing. And he wrote a book. He wrote two books, Alt Neuland, which was a kind of a novel. It's called Old New Land. And it really is describing his ideas about what this is. And then he had the Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state. And that was the practical handbook about how he saw this Jewish project. And he had two organizations, and this is how we're going to set it up, and this is what we're going to do. And it mostly went along those lines. And then he set up the first Zionist Congress it was going to be in Germany, but all the Reform Jews in Germany said, no, it's not in our country. And that's why he had to do it in Switzerland, because all the German Jews, there's a lot of Jews in Germany. And they're like, no, heck no, we're not going to do that. So that was interesting. So, but he said they were creating a corporation. In fact, if you see the early Israeli stock certificates for Zionist projects, it's a corporation in the bank. The Bank of England handles it. So if you were let's say you owned a $1 million furniture company in Bavaria, his idea was you were going to sell that to this settlement company for credits, but the British company holds on to it. It's a British company, but you've got credits for settling and getting a house in this new land. You're not going to get exactly one for one, but you'll have a nice place and you can start over again, that sort of thing. So it's a big asset transfer. It's taking money, housing, resources, and successful businesses from the Jews in Europe, transferring it to Britain for control, and then the Britain would resell it after the Jews left to the Christians. That's in Theodor Herzl's book, right? The Jewish Judenstaat, the Jewish state. That's his program, and it went roughly like it. But no Jew was taking it. Most Jews were like, we're not doing this. The Russian Jews would go down because they're getting beat up in Russia from the Tsar, the pogroms. So they were willing to go down there. And then after the revolution, they're getting their butt kicked too, but they're willing to go down. But by that time, Britain owned it after World War I. So they're like, we don't need Jews now. So they're like, eh. So, the history is very strange and very sad. But that was the modern state of Israel. So everybody wants to kind of portray it as it's a safety thing after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, that now there's this refugee crisis. But the plans had been laid in, and they were trying to get people to settle in Israel long before that. And Jews had lived in Israel since the Bar Kokhba revolt. I mean, forever they've been there. Yeshivas were there, right? So we have many of the sages. And remember that area, depending the time frame, was either owned by the Romans, then the Roman Christians, and then the Islamics came in. So the different Muslim empires would come in there, the Seleucids, the Abbasids, so they would be different ones, the Umayyads. But they were there, and even then, Jews could move around, no problem, own property, no problem. And the yeshivas stayed there, and the tombs, don't forget the tombs are there. There's Sarah, all right? So we have the tombs of Sarah, so everybody's there, right? The patriarchs, some of their tombs are still there. Some of the great sages are still there. And you could visit them. You could still do pilgrimages there. You could buy land and property there. It was never changed. Then the Crusades became a little difficult, but you could still stay there. And then when it got taken over again by Islam, it stayed there. And the Ottomans, you could always buy it, right? Up until when the British took over. And then they started saying you can't settle there during the 20s and 30s. About the same time as the rise of Hitler, they said, no, you can't come in. And they were controlling the immigration coming in, right? And then the United States did. And the Evian Conference, I don't know if you're here when I said the Evian Conference, but there was a conference after, or when Hitler took over. Hitler said, I'm going to take away the citizenship of all the Jews in Germany. Who wants them? And Golda Meir, one of the prime ministers, the first prime ministers of Israel, second prime minister of Israel, she was there, that's why we know a lot about it, because she was like, no country would take us, right? Except Japan. Japan wasn't at the conference, but it was Britain, America, France, Spain, Portugal, and a couple countries in South America said, yeah, we'll take 100,000, we'll take 30,000, but that was it, right? Not much. And remember, the Japanese approached him and said, we'll take them all, bring them over. Manchuria is big, bring it. And nope. So they sent Colonel Ishii home. Unfortunately, that was the sad part. So it's a lot more complicated than people think. And so when people say that, you have to go there, Jews can live anywhere. We're just human beings. We can live anywhere in the world that we want, right? So why, what is it about Jews that are so weak that they have to only live in Israel, right? Because, and Israel's not living law. So that's there. It could be. I mean, and again, you missed this part, but the interesting part about Hitler was that he's not even German, right? He came from Austria, and he was a stateless migrant in Austria-Hungary. He was a stateless migrant avoiding the draft from Austria-Hungary. Then he got caught up in Germany. His boyfriend joined the German military reserve unit, like reserve of the reserve unit, and then Hitler followed him in. But they were rear deck runners, right? And then when he joined the party, the Nazi party. They got funding. They were like a backwater party from nowhere. But about 1930 to 33, all of a sudden they get a lot of money. And everybody, when I grew up, it used to be that they got the money from German industrial concerns, right? So that's why the Germans right wing, because these big industries gave it to them. But there were six massive industries, or six huge corporations in Germany, like mega corporations like Microsoft, like our version of Microsoft or Tesla or Apple, huge, right? 5 of those 6 were owned by Americans. In fact, one of them, I think it was, I have to go back and look, but it was literally the CEO was American, right? The board had mostly American, the CEO was American, but it was a German company, right? It was a subsidiary of GE, right? So 5 of those, and those were the 5 companies that gave billions of millions of marks to the Nazi Party election fund. The only solely German-owned company did not. They gave it to the party that Bismarck was on, and I think some Christian Democrats, and I think the Center Party, which was a Catholic party. So they spread it out. But those 5 American-controlled companies basically financed the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, unfortunately, right? And that's how Hitler had all that money to kind of move up there. So he basically bribed his way in there. So that was pretty scary. So it may have been. There is also, let me look it up real quick. I don't want to mess this one up because I'm still investigating it. But there was a deal made. Let me get the dates right. When Nazi Germany, because before, when he got rid of all the citizenship for the Jews in Germany, you had to leave, but you could only take whatever could fit into a moving container. There was a small container, and they would label everything you had. You could only take whatever you could pack in there. And then there was only, I believe it was 10,000 marks you could leave the country with. That's why a lot of Jews didn't go, because they're like, we can't transfer our assets out. They kept waiting for a time where they could shift assets to go, so they wouldn't be destitute in some new country, right? But there was a deal made with the movement in the Havara Agreement. Here we go. All right, so this is important. So it's called the Havara Agreement, Haavara, 1923. So August 25th, 1933. And it was the economic agreement between Nazi Germany, who had just gotten in, and the Zionist Federation of Germany and the Jewish Agency for Palestine. So they allowed 60,000 German Jews, to immigrate to British Mandate Palestine between 1933 and 39. And as long as they could transfer assets, they had to use their money to buy German goods, and then they could ship those in excess of the normal economic limit, the limit on money, to go there. They deposited their funds into blocked accounts in Germany, managed by Havara Limited, a company established in Tel Aviv. The funds were used to buy German goods, which were shipped to Palestine and sold by Jewish businesses. Immigrants received payment in local currency upon arrival, recovering about 50 to 60% of their assets after fees and exchange losses. The Zionists did it because it gave them skilled migrants, because before that, remember, a lot of them were just the Russian kind of socialists were going there. The Germans, if they wanted to get out, they wanted to go to New York, right? people didn't want to go to Israel. They wanted to go to New York. And what happened was that, thank you for your due diligence. Yes, I have to make sure I get these things right. But basically they wanted to go to New York. So this allowed the colony group or the settler group in Israel to get skilled trade, scientists, huge, and economics, right? So they would bring the money over. Remember, they sold it, they get a cut. Then when the refugee comes over, they give him a little bit, right? And remarkably very similar to the Judenstaat that Theodor Herzl said, but it was a British bank. But this time they made the bank in Israel. But remember, Britain owned Israel in the 30s, right? And they set the quota for how many Jews could come in, and they were to reduce the quota because there were tensions now between the Arabs that were there and then the new migrants that were coming in from mostly Eastern Europe. So it was like, uh-oh. so they had to be in agreement because Britain had to agree to take this excess group in there. So a lot of political dealings that people don't talk about because it's uncomfortable, because it sets up very uncomfortable truths. But we have to face those truths. We have to look at those truths and say, okay, that's what it is. Now let's move forward and try to avoid violence and try to avoid a lot of hate and anger that tend to pop up when this subject comes up, because of double standards, because of obvious falsities and a lot of myths that keep getting perpetuated, and because of current political. In other words, let's just take the political out of it, right? Let's talk politics for politics, but the historical record and the religious record, okay, that's different. All right, we're going to separate those because that's separate, right? When we start blending all those together, it's a poison cocktail that just creates hate, misunderstanding, discontent, and generations of violence. And so that's why today on Shabbat, I wanted to kind of talk about that, because in my view, the more that we understand this, the more that we kind of look at this with clear eyes and good understanding, the better chance we have of reducing a lot of the generational violence that's kind of built up and continues to be perpetuated. And unfortunately, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick over there in Texas is perpetuating it, along with a lot of other blowhards that tend to not understand what they're saying. You don't define Judaism. Half the Jews don't even define Judaism, right? Depends what shul you go to, right? Who's your big rabbi? Okay, that's how you're going to define it, right? Which Mishnah do you read? Which one do you listen to? So, and this has been going on for generations, right? Hillel and Shammai is famous, but it's all throughout, and that's the beauty. The beauty of it really in religion is that you can sometimes have variations depending on history, location, groups, and things like that. And that's one of the wonderful tradition of Judaism that should be preserved. And unfortunately, Israel kind of destroys that, right? Because they want a monoculture. They want to destroy it. They've destroyed Yiddishkeit. The Yemenites that were there, they've destroyed much of that. The Falashes, they kind of wiped out that tradition from the African Jews that came up. There's a lot of great traditions that unfortunately were destroyed. But again, Israel was not a religious, it wasn't their duty. They were not religious. They were a secular socialist. And so they wanted this, socialist culture that they wanted to imprint. The problem came in when a lot of Americans like Lieutenant Dan Patrick in Texas, who were the inheritors of these dispensationalists from Britain, because Britain, through the Presper Brotherhood, had giant tent revivals in America in the 1880s and 90s, and I think 1900s even. And the Texas megachurches with 1 billion in assets and 90,000 members are direct lineage descendants of the same group that was promoting that for the British colonial interest, right? Guarding the flank of the Suez Canal, trying to push everybody over there. And they were trying to get the Americans on board with this scheme. And they created this. And now there's a whole generation, third, fourth, fifth generation, mostly centered in Texas in these megachurches, that honestly believe that they're going to force the end times by forcing or pushing the Jews there. And now it's going to happen. This is going to be the moment they're doing it, but they don't understand from a Jewish perspective, and from many other Christians as well, dispensationalism is horrible, right? Because at the end of that story, and dispensationalist story, the Jews that don't convert die, right? What? And again, if God is the judge and he made the sentence, who are you to commute the sentence? When the judge commutes the sentence, that's when you go in there. And that's the religious aspect. The scientific aspect is Shlomo Sands. Most Jews are not genetic from Abraham at all, right? We're all converts, right? Up until 300 AD in the West, up until about 700 AD in the areas that the Islam had conquered from the Christian lands and up in Persia and things like that. So the reality is not magic elf people, just human beings like everyone else. And why in the world, there's special considerations ever given is ridiculous, right? And so if you believe that the Apaches need to go back to New Mexico, take over much of Chihuahua in Mexico, New Mexico, that needs to go back to Apaches because that's their Garden of Eden right there in Gila, New Mexico. And they've been through genocide, a cultural genocide, right? They're off on reservations now. We pushed them out. Those land is not theirs anymore, right? That's the birthplace of Geronimo and so many others. So unless Ted Cruz is sitting there saying, okay, get out, Americans, we're putting the Apache in there, you're not consistent. right? You don't really believe the principle of what you're saying. You're doing it for political, but you're painting a target on the back of Jews while you're doing it, and that's dangerous, and that needs to stop, in my opinion. So that's my 2 cents for Shabbat. So any other questions? If not, I have to go down. I've got some challah and some wine and some some bread. We gotta do. I've been waiting on down there. But any other questions? And there we go. Actually, let me check over on, because I know some of these questions don't go through. So I will check Rumble, and then we should go. Oh, and that one's good. We'll check once over here with YouTube, and then we will call it a night. And thank you, Black Wolf, for coming on. Like I said, I'm surprised you sleep with that new edition there, so that's pretty good. Oh, and then on another topic, if you want the map OSINT, I made that about 2 hours ago, and we're talking about how to use map systems for OSINT. That's another video that was uploaded before this one. This one's live. That one was a little bit recorded, but it's pretty good, and it's a kind of a surprise, and it goes into religion a little bit. In New Mexico, there's kind of a hidden area with. It's quite surprising. So there's some hidden history in there, but there's also techniques in how to use maps, some free OSINT maps on the internet to get more information that just Google Maps isn't going to really help you with. And it gives you a great tool for doing not only modern investigations in the areas around there and getting information from satellites and from different ways of looking at maps, but also for historical investigations. A really great tool that I like to use. It puts two maps side by side. We show you how to use that, and it's a little bit longer video, but it's really fascinating because there was a variation of flagellites called, well, I don't want to give it away, but they're sitting there in New Mexico, and it was actually generational. And it links into a murder, the Hayes Code, kind of a documentary, and then you'll be really surprised with the punchline at the end, what happened and what may happen. But it all revolves around a death bell that went missing in the 1930s. So it absolutely captivated me today. I was supposed to be 10 minutes, but ended up being like 40 because talk about. We'll call it a night. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Any questions, any comments, feel free to go ahead and write it up there. No answers, no wrong questions. Again, this is my opinion based upon, looking at this from various angles. But it is my belief that a good look at this will reduce tensions, create a little bit safer environment for all concerned, and reduce a lot of that. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Have a great night and enjoy Friday the 13th.